Hello, Pastor Mike here, and over the next 3 weeks, or if you're watching the videos, over the next 3 videos, I'm going to be revealing to you the vision, the mission, and the strategy of Foothills Fellowship moving forward. We, the elders, sense that God has given us something new moving forward. But before I do this, I need to give you some background because context, as you know, is key. So let me take you back to the year 2017. For the last few years before that, my associate pastor Joe and I would sit down for a few days toward the end of the year to think and to pray and to talk about vision for the next year. We would come up with a vision for the next year, and then we would take it to the elders, and we would bat that around together for a while, and together we'd come up for a plan for the year moving forward. Then at the beginning of that next year, Joe and I would then use our sermon time on Sunday mornings, usually in January, to kind of lay out the vision for the year. Here's an example of our 2016 vision pamphlet. But we had big charts and strategies with measurables, and we kind of had a plan for the year. We tried to keep those plans in front of us for the entire year as leaders and as elders. So it's the end of 2017, and Joe and I are meeting together to do what we had done in the years past, to pray, to listen, to talk, to dream about 2018. But that time, it was different. To best sum up that time together, we came out of that after a couple of days, and we just had nothing. We had nothing. Maybe it was a brain block, and I'll grant it that sometimes that happens. Maybe Joe and I just couldn't inspire each other anymore. I don't know, but we were at a loss. And all the tools for ministry that we had used in the past, we realized these things aren't working anymore. People aren't engaging in ministry, and things just felt really flat. And so maybe it was us, or maybe, and I think what we found out, sure, some of it's us for sure, but we also found out that there was at that time, and probably even before that, but we were becoming aware of a dramatic shift in the culture and in the church culture as well that we just weren't prepared for, and we found ourselves stuck. And so we went to the elders at the end of 2017 and said that we just don't have anything. And it's a pretty scary place to be when you're a leader of an organization and you just don't feel like you have any vision for moving forward. So rather than forcing anything, the elders decided to keep praying and to keep listening. And we moved into 2018 just kind of plugging away with what we were already doing, knowing that we just really needed to hear from the Lord. And so for me, this was a real period of frustration. I wondered if my time at Foothills Fellowship was coming to an end. Perhaps God wasn't giving me vision because my time here was over. I felt very unsettled, very disillusioned, and just kind of frustrated moving into 2018. Now, let's back it up a bit. As you know, in 2017, at the beginning of that year, we planted a church in the International District, and they just celebrated 5 years anniversary this month. We sent the Hardens, and Jesse would be the pastor of that church. We sent the Platts and the Brockts and the Dumases. So a couple of families from our church, they all went, they moved into the International District and began incarnational ministry there. So leading up to that, Jesse and I had spent well over a year exploring church planting, church coaching organizations that could help us do a church plant. We had never done it before. We needed outside help. And the one that he actually landed on using as kind of a coaching organization for him was one that I didn't know anything about, actually. It was one that I wasn't involved in looking at with him. It's called 3DM. Now, 3DM is not a denomination. It is not an association of churches. They refer to themselves as a movement, and their website describes themselves this way. We are made up of men and women around the world who are following Jesus together, multiplying disciples who make disciples, and empowering spiritual families to live on mission for the sake of the lost. We are a richly diverse movement of people from different walks of life, socioeconomic context, ethnic backgrounds, and spiritual traditions. What unites us is our love for God, our desire to live the life Jesus modeled for us, and our passion to see the good news of his kingdom come to all people. Now, they provide coaching and resources for individuals, for small groups, for churches, for even church plants on, as they say on their website, multiplying disciples who make disciples and empowering spiritual families to live on mission for the sake of the lost. We'll good. So anyway, Jesse comes to me in early 2018. Now, this is just after Joe and I realized, and the elders, we're just struggling here with vision for moving forward. And we're praying about that. And Jesse wants me to meet two of the key leaders from 3DM that were just so happening to be visiting Albuquerque. And he wanted me to come on a Monday. Now, what's funny about this is that Mondays are my day off. And one piece of vision, I didn't get much at the end of 2017, but one piece of vision personally for me was that I needed to protect my day off. And so when he called me, I told him no. I said I wasn't going to come. But he persisted. I think he persisted because he was trying to explain 3DM and how they were helping churches and how they were helping him. And he could tell from our prior conversations that I really wasn't understanding what he was talking about. And so I think he wanted me really to hear it from somebody that might be able to explain it better. And so if you know Jesse, you know it's very difficult to tell him no. And so I went. And after spending a couple of hours there, I left lunch with them, and I felt hopeful. I felt encouraged, like maybe, just maybe, there's something there for us. I felt that the perspective on church and on being disciples who make disciples that they presented to me might be a path forward for us and an answer to some of the prayers that we were praying for God to give us wisdom. So in early 2018, all of the elders began considering how the coaches of 3DM might be able to help us. So this involved most of the elders going to a 2-day kind of come and see seminar that was held here in Albuquerque, actually in 2018. And then it involved also me and Joe and Melissa and Michelle, so Joe, his wife, me, my wife, being a part of what is called a 3DM learning community. And we would go to Phoenix every 6 months for about 3 or 4 days for the next 2.5 years and receive coaching, take our church context to them, learn, and then they would kind of help us think, well, how might some of these principles play out in our church setting? It also meant that the four of us would begin being huddled. Now, if you're not familiar with huddles, you will be familiar as we move forward, but some of you are familiar with huddles. We would be huddled by 3DM leaders over Zoom, and so we began that. And for me, now, 4 years later, I'm still being huddled twice a month by some of these leaders on Zoom. So we're contemplating in 2018 and moving forward how 3DM can help us. And we're starting to get some clarity, and we're beginning to make some plans and some strategies and even implement some of these things within the church. As a matter of fact, it was the second week of March in 2020 that we were in Phoenix for our last of 5 learning communities where we had kind of a plan, a strategy for kind of really unveiling this when we got back, and then COVID. And matter of fact, we were stranded in Phoenix when COVID hit and things started shutting down. We made it home, but as you know, COVID changed everything. COVID forced our church and all other churches to just go into survival mode. For the whole world, which also included local churches like ours, COVID just changed everything. And it forced us, namely, to stay away from one another. And that's the exact opposite of what churches are supposed to be doing. And then responding to it, as we all know now, really caused huge divisions in our country, in the world, and it trickled down into the church as well. It forced pastors like me to learn how to live stream, which was an absolute nightmare. It forced us to do video recordings like this one, to connect with people over Zoom. But one thing that it did do for us as elders of Foothills was it caused us to meet more than ever before. We had the task, like all other church leaders had, of keeping the church together during this time as much as we possibly could. And so we gathered on Zoom a lot over especially that first year of COVID to pray and to figure things out. So after a year or so of survival mode, now we're coming into 2021, we began thinking about the future of Foothills. The changes to the culture and to the church that we were sensing rumblings about before COVID really became obvious and defined to us and to a lot of people, obviously, during COVID. And so we started talking about what Foothills will and should look like moving forward. How do we move forward? How have things changed? And how do we as a church, as leaders, need to change things in order to move forward in a way that is God-pleasing, effective, and connects with people that are now in a very changed culture around us? It was during the lockdown also that I discovered a book that would prove to be super helpful for us elders. I read it and then I asked the elders to read it and to discuss it together. The book is called Canoeing the Mountains, Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory by Todd Bolsinger. And I won't go into great detail about the book, but I'll just kind of give you a couple of premises that the book had that proved to be very helpful for us. The first one is that we are no longer living in the age of Christendom in America. And it says that around 2000, the early 2000s, things began to really shift. The premise is that we are now living in a post-Christian society here in America, much like what has already happened in places like Europe. It implies that Christianity is no longer the dominant civil religion of our society. It has gradually assumed the values and the culture and the worldviews that are not necessarily Christian. One of the examples that I think he brings up in this, or I heard on an interview, is that even back in the 70s and early 80s, the LA Times, for instance, would have church listings in there where you can go to church. It would put in weekly Bible readings or daily Bible readings in the newspaper. And that's laughable now. And that's kind of just a little reflection of what's going on in our culture. The concept called Canoeing the Mountains refers to Lewis and Clark. And I love history. And so with Lewis and Clark and their expeditions kind of weaved into this book, it was very good for me. But Lewis and Clark were skilled watermen, canoers. And they, though, had to adapt once they realized that there is not a waterway to the Pacific Ocean. They smacked right into the Rocky Mountains. And they were forced to face what it meant if they were going to reach their goal of the Pacific Ocean. Do they just stop? Do they turn around? Or do they move forward? But they have to move forward in a different way. And so for the church, another premise is the ways that we did church during Christendom in America, analogy would be canoeing the rivers like Lewis and Clark, won't work anymore once we face the rugged terrain of the mountains. And for us, it would be post-Christianity and now accelerated by what COVID has done to churches. So we have to adapt. And he goes through this book and talks about all the ways in which Lewis and Clark actually did adapt. And one of the things that they did is they tore apart their canoes because they weren't useful anymore. And they had to reconstruct things like turn the canoes into sleds to pull their supplies up, things like that. And then one of the final premises is that COVID has accelerated our need to get out of the boat and adapt. And so if you go back to 2017, the end of 2017, moving into 2018, I was just realizing that the boat doesn't work anymore. All of the tools and skills and things that I think I and we as elders and leaders had, they just weren't working anymore. We were facing the Rocky Mountains, and then the Rocky Mountains got a lot higher once COVID hit. So as you can imagine, this made for some great discussion for us as elders as we thought about Foothills moving forward. And it made for some great prayer points for us. And a lot of it was crying out, God, we just don't know what to do. Would you please help us? It helped us to realize that if we want to make it to our Pacific Ocean, what is our goal as a church, then we need to revisit that goal, our vision and our mission as a church, and make sure that it's a worthy one. It's time to revisit. What are we doing as a church? What is our goal as a church? What is our vision and mission? Second thing that it made us kind of reevaluate was that we needed to be willing to tear apart our canoes and consider a new way of moving forward. What would it look like to tear apart our canoes? What does it look like for us to basically put everything that we've ever known or done when it comes to ministry and leadership basically on a table and say, does any of this work anymore? And if not, are we willing to get rid of them? Are we willing to make changes to certain things? Or are there new things that we need to add to the table? And so that it caused us to have good discussions about that. And then it also kind of called the need for us to, like Lewis and Clark, who had Native American guides that they ran into as they started walking up the Rocky Mountains, who helped them through the uncharted territories. People who were already there, people who already had ways in which they could survive and actually get over the Rocky Mountains. Well, we realized that we needed to seek out and put our trust in guides outside the church who, I mean, they could be a part of other churches, but outside of our church to help us because we just didn't know how to move forward. And so we decided that everything that we had done as a church up to this point, everything that we are currently doing is fair game. And that's a pretty big deal for a group of very diverse elders, age-wise and experience-wise, and even some of our nuanced theological leanings and our nuanced view of the church. It was pretty spectacular to see that we all said, okay, we don't know how to move forward, but we're willing to put everything on the table. And so we did. And we said, if canoes are no longer going to get us to our goal, then a goal that we needed to reconsider anyway, then once we had identified what our new goal was, what our Pacific Ocean was, we needed to seriously evaluate our vehicles for getting there. If canoes don't work, what works? Maybe we even need to tear apart these canoes and do away with them and do something different. And so we began first by reconsidering our goal, our Pacific Ocean, as a church in the form of our vision and our mission, and what do we want our church to become, and what's our ultimate goal? What must we do to realize then this vision? What is our mission that will allow us to get us to the Pacific? And once we had answered these questions, which took very many months, it wasn't like something we did overnight, we had to ask ourselves, what's our strategy then? So if we know what our goal is, we have our mission, well, how do we actually do it? What are the practical things that we need to do? Who do we need to be in order to accomplish this mission and vision? And so that's the story leading up to what we want to unveil to you over the next couple of weeks or videos, as you might be watching these online. That's the context. And like I've said many times before, context is key to what I want to tell you next. And without this context, what I tell you next might not make any sense. But please understand, again, and this context helps, that what I'm going to tell you next was not decided upon abruptly. It was not decided without literally now 5 years of prayer and study and discussion and listening to the Lord and listening to one another and talking with people and doing some experimenting, trying some things out. And again, some of you who are part of Foothills, you've been a part of some of these experiments. So what I want to tell you next is a result of years of seeking the Lord together as elders. And what I want to tell you next will have to wait for the next video because this is where we're going to stop today, because I want the story to stand alone. But next week or the next video, I promise that I'm going to fill in the blanks on all three of these things: vision, mission, and strategy. I'll tell you the new vision, and it's not unlike the one that we have, but it's a little more fine-tuned. I'll tell you about our mission, which is somewhat different, and I'll tell you about our strategy, which again, we've experimented with some things, but we really feel like we've kind of honed in and really pinpointed what a good strategy will be for Foothills moving forward. It's just that the the contextual story is too important not to tell and let it stand alone. And so next week or next video, many of your questions will be answered. And hopefully, if you join us next week at our church building when I'm talking about these things, we may have some time even to discuss them together as a congregation, or for sure by the third week, we'll have some time to discuss things, because there's a lot of implications for the things that we're going to be talking about. But this story needs to stand alone so you can see not only what we as elders have done, but what God has done. And God has brought the right people, the right resources, the right things to us in the right times. Honestly, it has been a very difficult 5-year journey leading up to this point for me. And I think the other elders would say the same. But I think, honestly, all of us, especially as we kind of came to a culmination of all of this a couple of weeks ago when we sat down for a Saturday for fasting and prayer, I think all of us would say, wow, look at what God has done. And we are so excited to tell you all about it next time.